So a very warm welcome to all our viewers and welcome to a new edition of Arab Affairs, our show bringing you all the latest news and events happening all around the Arab region. I'm Angie Meher joining you for this afternoon's edition of the show, and as usual we begin straight away with a look at some of the news making the headlines, and beginning with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who offered his sincere condolences to the victims of the shooting accident in the Wadi al-Kabir neighborhood in Muscat, praying to God to bless the deceased souls, wishing patience and solace to their families and a speedy recovery for the injured. This came on Saturday as the President held a phone call with Oman's Sultan Haytham bin Tariq, expressing Egypt's condemnation of the terrorist incident and full solidarity with the Sultanate of Oman in the face of terrorism and extremism. For his part, the Sultan appreciated Egypt's position in support of the Sultanate, stressing the depth and strength of historical and fraternal bilateral relations and its country's keenness to continue consolidating distinguished bilateral cooperation at all fronts. Still with our news, on behalf of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Prime Minister Dr. Mustafa Madbouli headed on Saturday to Ghana's capital Accra to take part in the 6th mid-year coordination meeting of the African Union. Egypt is now chairing the new Partnership for Africa's Development Agency, NEPAD. Madbouli is expected to hold a string of bilateral meetings with a number of top African officials on the sidelines of the AU meeting. He will also tackle fundamental files related to development of efforts aimed at boosting economic integration amongst countries of the African Union. Still with more news, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said in a statement Saturday that Egypt welcomed an advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice. And this, of course, the Minister of Foreign Migration and Egyptian Expatriates Affairs, Badr Abdelati, confirmed that the government has made great efforts to make amendments aimed at creating supportive climate to invest and encourage private sector investors. This came during a meeting held by Abdelati with a group of senior Ghanaian business persons representing the sectors of construction, medicine, shipping, energy, food products and agricultural projects. Minister of Foreign Affairs, Migration and Egyptian Expatriates Affairs confirmed that the government has made great efforts to encourage private sectors. This came, the ministry spokesperson, Ambassador Ahmed Abu Zaid, said the foreign minister pointed that Egypt has adopted an ambitious economic program and has put improvement of investment climate at the top of its priorities. He also asserted that the Egyptian government is working on enhancing the ability of the private sector to engage strongly and drive the economic growth by strengthening partnership between both public and private sectors. And for today's main topic, the International Court of Justice has deemed Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, as unlawful, and Egypt has welcomed the advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. We have more details in this report. Egypt has welcomed the advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice, which deemed Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, as unlawful. Issued in response to a 2022 UN General Assembly request, the ICJ's opinion deems the continued Israeli occupation as a violence of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and a breach of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. The landmark opinion urges Israel to swiftly end the occupation, halt new settlement and remove existing settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Foreign Ministry statement said Egypt further welcomes the ICJ's call in all states and international organizations, including the United Nations, to refuse recognition of the Israeli occupation's legal standing. Statement noted that Egypt also commended the ICJ's request to the United Nations General Assembly and the UN Security Council to put in place the necessary measures to end this unlawful Israeli presence. The statement called on all international parties to implement the ICJ's advisory opinion, enabling the Palestinian people to exercise their legal right to self-determination and end the humanitarian suffering they are enduring. It added Egypt has called for an end to Israeli attacks on Gaza and unrestricted humanitarian aid access. Egypt reiterated its commitment to supporting Palestinian rights, including an independent state on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as the capital, advocating for a just and lasting peace based on a two-state solution. And still with more news on the same issue, the UN highest court said that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories and settlements are illegal and they should be withdrawn as soon as possible in one of its strongest findings to date on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. More details to follow. The United Nations highest court said that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and settlements there are illegal and should be withdrawn as soon as possible in its strongest findings to date on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. The opinion by judges at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, known as the World Court, was not binding but carries weight under international law and may weaken support for Israel. The court said Israel's obligations include paying restitution for harm and the evacuation of all settlers from existing settlements. Meanwhile, in a swift reaction, Israel's foreign ministry rejected the opinion as fundamentally wrong and one-sided and repeated its stance that a political settlement in the region can only be reached by negotiations. The opinion also angered West Bank settlers as well as politicians such as Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, whose nationalist religious party is close to the settler movement and who himself lives in a West Bank settlement. Meanwhile, the head of the Benjamin Regional Council, one of the largest settler councils, said that the ICJ's opinion was contrary to morality and international law. ICJ opinion also found that the UN Security Council and General Assembly and all states have an obligation not to recognize the occupation as legal, nor render aid or assistance towards maintaining Israel's presence in the occupied territories. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry, meanwhile, called the opinion historic and urged states to adhere to it. For more news, the Israeli occupation forces meanwhile continue their aggression on the Gaza Strip with the 288th day, killing and wounding scores of Palestinians in sporadic areas in the Strip. We have the details. Israeli occupation forces continue their aggression on the Gaza Strip for the 288th day, killing and wounding scores of Palestinians in sporadic areas in the Strip. Meanwhile, occupation's artillery shelled Tal al-Hawa neighborhood and comes in a Nusayrat camp, central Gaza Strip. Medical sources said the search for the missing is undergoing after the Israeli bombardment. Israeli forces bombed parts of central Gaza Friday, killing at least 8 Palestinians in the camp area, while fighting with Hamas fighters raged in Rafah in the south, where health officials said another 5 residents were killed. Into the 10th month of war, Israel's aerial and tank shelling of central Gaza has intensified in the past week, killing dozens. Residents said the Israeli army blew up dozens of homes in the past 3 days. Palestinian health officials said 8 people were killed in 2 separate Israeli airstrikes on 2 houses earlier on Friday. In Rafah, where Israel said it aimed to dismantle the last battalions of Hamas's armed wing, residents said fierce gun battles were heard in central and western areas. Medics said 5 people died in Israeli fire and 3 bodies were moved to Nasser Hospital. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said a long-sought ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was within sight, saying negotiators were driving towards the goal line. At least 38,848 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's offensive since then, according to the Gaza health authorities.